Welcome to EB-5 Investment Voice, where attorney insights intersects with immigration investments. If you are a foreign investor, domestic fund manager, or enterprising entrepreneur and want to get the most out of the EB-5 program, you have come to the right place. I'm Mark Deal, and I'll be your co-host on this journey. I'm joined by your host, Mona Shaw, and other attorneys at Mona Shaw & Associates, as well as immigration leaders from around the world. So let's get into EB-5 Investment Voice.
You know, Mark, many people ask us how we come up with our different topics. Because at the end of the day, this is EB-5 and we're 121 episodes? And it's
at least, yeah. And special episodes and panels with multiple people. Yes.
So it's like, are we regurgitating topics? Well, not really, I would say, because so many of our guests have differing angles and it's shaped by their own experience. And as few guests have as broad or as diverse an experience as our present guest has.
That's right, Mona. And that's not to knock any of our past guests. It's just that the person that we have lined up today certainly has a wealth of experience in a lot of different areas. And that is Joe McCarthy. Joe is a former immigration attorney, has operated multiple EB-5 regional centers nationwide, is the co-founder of the America Dream Fund, which is an EB-5 regional center based in Los Angeles, California, and currently serves on the board of directors for the Association to Invest in the USA. IIUSA. You're all used to hearing that acronym. And through his various roles, he has personally been involved in the deployment of over $850 million of EB-5 capital. Joe McCarthy, welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm very excited to be here.
Joe, you've been doing EB-5 as long as I have, I think. When did you start?
I started in EB-5 somewhere around 2006, 2007. So it's been close to 15 years.
And so you have seen all of the way that EB-5 has progressed, which makes you, again, the perfect person for many of these questions, because some of these issues that we're going to deal with really haven't changed over the years. But the one thing which we have noticed, of course, is with the loss of the Chinese market, we had a lot of other markets come in. And we had a lot of H-1B investors who came in, who had filed an I-140 petition for an EB-2 and realized that they had an awful long wait, so they filed an EB-5 because they were just so tired of waiting. So I don't know if you're aware, but the October Bulletin just came out, and the October Bulletin has jumped India as one of the big H-1B countries quite significantly. And as a consequence, I'm anticipating that we're going to get a lot of people who now are eligible for their I-140 who filed for their EB-5. So there's going to be the obvious question, which I'm going to ask you. All these people who might have put their money in the last year or year and a half, suddenly now they're eligible under a different category for a green card, and they want to withdraw their EB-5. How far can we go and tell the project, return their money? They don't need to do EB-5 anymore. They have another immigrant passage.
Well, unfortunately, probably not very far. The reality is that there are essentially two different tracks within an EB-5 project. There's a path for the immigration, and then there's a path for the investment. The investment side, although it's connected to an immigration program, is relatively agnostic of it. It's by and large a traditional investment. When you initiate an EB-5 project and explain to the project that it has so many years to kind of grow its business and use the capital as part of its development, it nevertheless adheres to its own timeline. And that may not change even if there are changes in the immigration world.
Yep, I totally agree. We have brought this point up several times in our podcast in different ways. But I feel like it's something that we keep having to emphasize, that it's a business. It's not just an immigration program.
Likewise. I mean, we've had conversations with our clients over the years, and at different stages of the EB-5 process, we try to remind them as frequently as possible that this is an investment and they should think of it as an investment, but that investment comes with an immigration benefit, which may distinguish it from other investments. So as you mentioned, that there's sometimes little to nothing that can be done if an investor's priorities accelerate.
Right. So, okay, let's just go back to this scenario, though. And you have a client, or we have a client, or you have many investors who came from China. They just don't want to wait anymore. And they are at that point that, look, we just want to withdraw our money. Can a project, can the NCE, can the JCE, can they return the capital?
Most likely, no. A lot of that's going to be dictated by kind of the documents with the project, whether that's a loan agreement or some sort of other investment vehicle. But then there's also the business reality, which is in order for a project to divest investment capital, it has to reach a certain stage of stability or maturity. And they may not be in a position yet where they're able to do it.
Okay, so you did mention, and I'm going to bring it up, does it make any difference if the project is set up with the NCE, giving the investors a preferred equity status as opposed to the NCE giving a loan to the project?
The bulk of our experience has been investing EB-5 capital as debt because that provides collateral.
As a loan.
Provides kind of...
You mean debt as a loan?
Yes, absolutely. And there are specified maturities and rights as a lender. In my limited experience with equity, there are nevertheless still kind of holding periods for the project where you don't have a right or a put right to demand divestment before a specific date. And the purpose of that is the project needs time to grow and then stabilize before it's in a position to find long-term capital that may be the source of divesting EB-5 investors.
In other words, if the investor has a replacement, are you saying, then they may consider it? If not, then likelihood if the money has already been utilized by the project, it won't be able to withdraw?
Most likely, I would agree with that. The project just may not have the necessary liquidity to start divesting before it was anticipated. So
right.
I'm sure that there are folks that might be able to point to examples where, equity was able to accommodate. But in my experience, most projects need that full investment horizon in order to kind of get to a point where they can start returning capital.
Well, as I said, we've had this discussion before, and I've discussed with Pat Hogan, who really stated that, no, this is an at-risk program.
Yes.
Your money's at risk, and you cannot just suddenly willy-nilly decide halfway through that you want to withdraw, even if your personal circumstances dictate that you can.
And that's a good example of examining it from the immigration path. I mean, I was speaking more to the business path, but
right.
As you know, that EB-5 has its own requirements, which is at risk, subject to the gains and losses of a market. And the program itself wasn't really intended for it to be just kind of placing money in something and just being able to pick it back up when you want it to.
Right. Well, this podcast is all about post-offering obligations for regional centers. And as you have your regional center for many years and you've done many projects, we thought you would be the best person to be able to answer these. But I know that every year things do change. Typically, many projects, and we've seen that recently as well, where they have rented a regional center, they really are not aware of what obligations they actually do have to the investors. What rights does a typical EB-5 investor actually have? Are they allowed to vote and inspect the books and come along and see if the project's doing properly? Well,
by and large, absolutely. A good place to start would be the operating agreement, the limited partnership. Often there are rights spelled out there. Certainly, it would describe what sort of activities require a vote. Often those aren't extensive. Most of the management decisions is vested into the general partner, and your EB-5 investors are limited partners. That in no way limits, inspection rights or rights to visit the project or, communication with the general partner.
But Joe, wouldn't a project hate having 30 people or even 20 people, potential investors that don't really understand the project, just happen to descend upon them on a regular basis to inspect?
Well, the inspection rights relate to the EB-5 entity itself. It doesn't necessarily extend to the project's books. In those situations, you would look to the loan agreement in terms of what reporting requirements are required from the borrower. So as the EB-5 entity stands, the communication needs to be pretty free-flowing with the EB-5 investor. And hopefully the EB-5 entity has a good relationship with the project, that they're getting, some sort of financial statements on quarterly or annual bases, and that information can be conveyed to the EB-5 investor.
That's true, but at the same time, I would have said that the EB-5 investor doesn't really have the right to go to the job creating entity and demand those. It's more of, for the NCE, yes, but not from the JCE.
You're absolutely correct. And I should have made a better distinction. The books of the NCE are an open book, but the project books, any sort of reporting requirement is going to be described in, whatever loan instrument or private equity instrument. And you're correct that an EB-5 investor doesn't really have the right to walk into the hotel or whatever it is and say, please open up.
Now that you've said that, I'm setting you up here. So immigration attorneys who do 829s and look after the EB-5 investors, we want to make sure that the project is behaving the way it's supposed to behave. So what kind of obligations do we have, does the regional center have to make sure that the project is behaving accordingly?
In a lot of documents, you first ask the project to comply with the business plan as it was described. The regional center or the general partner will be receiving some sort of financials on some sort of time interval. And those are a good way to track whether the project is making progress as it thought in its initial pro forma. So there are a variety of ways that you monitor the project to make sure that it's tracking with the original business plan, which, as you're interested, is, all of those are kind of inputs into job creation, which is the big one for the EB-5 clients.
Have you ever had a problem with some of your projects getting information?
We haven't, but that's also has a lot to do with picking which projects that you're going to invest in and, establishing early that lines of communication and outlining what they're required to do. We've been very fortunate that we've had good partners and had little difficulty over the years.
I must say, you've had many years of experience and you haven't had any problems, Joe?
We haven't, actually.
Okay. We have experienced projects where there have been problems and projects where they really haven't been forthcoming and they've actually made changes, which could be considered to be material changes. Because really, because it's an EB-5 program, we should be having regular updates. And if you don't get them, then you have a big problem.
You're absolutely right. I think part of it is the obligation of, the regional center or the general partner to make sure that they're staying in front of the project. And even under good circumstances, it's not a bad idea to have check-ins at regular intervals, and keeping that line of communication open promotes your ability to see if there are potential bumps down the road.
Other than informing the investor of changes, including any material changes, what happens if a project really experiences a delay or an increase in cost or something like COVID now? What are the obligations of the regional center in a time of COVID?
A best practice is to stay frequently involved. We talked a little bit about that before. With something like COVID, it was an obvious example of needing to pick up the phone and say, we know all of this is going on in the industry. How is it affecting you? And what is your current game plan?
Is that a different communication path or channel than what was used in the past?
Many regional centers, including us, provide annual reports. We also, in special circumstances, and COVID was certainly one of them, prepared kind of a special update that we sent out to investors, just with the idea that they understood that COVID was dramatically affecting the U.S. and obviously they have a particular interest in their EB-5 investment, that we took that as an opportunity to put something together and let people know how projects were weathering the storm.
Right. Well, we do know that if there's a material change, such as something really materially in the scope and the nature of the project or an ownership structure, that an investor does have the right to rescind. But I don't think that would account to anything related to COVID, would it? I know people are asking.
Yeah, and I don't view COVID as a material change. It's obviously just kind of an external economic factor of something that is impacting multiple sectors across the U.S. economy. That by itself does not lead to material change. It just kind of leads to challenges that the project has to work through.
So in a project where, obviously there's a number of changes and we've seen a number of changes in the market and the documents are not really very comprehensive as to the investor's rights or even the rights of the developer. What happens if a developer decides that he wants to, say, increase the term of his loan or make another change or something which is not contemplated expressly in their original documents? What would the regional center have to do?
The regional center would have to think carefully, and they certainly need to enlist the assistance of their counsel to kind of examine, is this indeed a material change? Does this require consent to the limited partners? Is this something that's within the business judgment of a general partner? There's no single determining factor. It's looking at the sum total and certainly enlisting the assistance of your service providers to really weigh what's going to be in the best interest of the EB-5 investor. Is there going to be any implications to their immigration status or progress? It's a good opportunity to really dig into what's going on with the project and to get the right help to make sure that we're making the best decisions.
Yeah, because the regional center like yourself, now just to be clear, you're a third-party regional center, right? You don't have equity in many of the projects.
That's correct.
Yeah, so you just facilitate the EB-5 investors coming in and loaning to the project. In such a situation, you're kind of torn because you have an obligation to your investors and at the same time you have a relationship with your developer.
Yeah, but one of the benefits of what you described as being kind of a third party is that it avoids conflicts of interest. I mean, our job is to represent the EB-5 investors, and so it's fairly aligned. Given that we're not the project, our job is to represent our clients and to make sure that whatever the crisis is, that we're helping them move to safe ground. That is a very big reason why we choose that model, is that it keeps our obligations and loyalties very simple.
A few years ago, I think we all thought differently when we saw so many projects putting up their own regional centers. But time has shown us, Joe, that this model is much better and healthier for the investor than the model whereby the project is also the regional center.
We were never a supporter of the other model. You have to understand the nature of EB-5 investment, that you are somebody who lives in a different country. You are relying on somebody to represent your interests. We've always believed that it needs to be very clear and very simple. And so we've enjoyed our model in terms of the ability to make it clear who we represent.
Yeah, I totally agree. Joe, having been in the EB-5 industry for so long, we have seen not only the progression, but all of the different drafts of legislation that have passed through. I now know we've worked together in IIUSA on reviewing the drafts all the way back 2015, I would presume. What are your thoughts and what do you see coming forth now?
Well, perhaps foolishly, I'm an endless optimist on this subject.
Foolishly.
And I shouldn't be, given how many times we've all pushed the boulder up the hill only to have it roll back down. It seems with each iteration of legislation that we've both worked on, we push the ball a little bit further than we did before. Similarly, with work that's been done in 2020, the legislation that we've worked on this past year, it tends to be much more sophisticated, much more detailed. It tends to start really getting into the issues that all of the different stakeholders would like to see resolved in order for it to be passed. But like many other years, there's always some sort of externality that influences Congress and then how quickly they're able to move on this. As everybody knows, 2020 has been an unusual year. So I'm optimistic. I think that we've done great work. And I'm excited to see what 2021 is going to hopefully finally bring on this front.
Well, one thing I do want to point out is that what we have seen over the years is a lot of real estate in EB-5, and I would like to see EB-5 in other industries.
Yeah, that's always been investor driven. What EB-5 investors view as a good investment opportunity. But you're correct that there are some that are not real estate based. Our business model has been to focus on real estate, but over the years, I've had the good fortune of seeing other groups really get creative and do some really interesting things in EB-5. I mean, what are your thoughts about legislation, Mona? I mean, you've pushed that same boulder that I have.
That's very true. Well, people do ask if the Democrats are better for us than the Republicans. And I would say that EB-5 is one immigration area that I feel both parties would be good. I think both parties see the benefits. Maybe perhaps the current administration is not so pro-immigration, but they do certainly appreciate investment. And I think that we would, if this current administration comes back in, we could probably see something in relation to increasing the EB-5. But as far as legislation is concerned, every single person has got one topic and one wish when we give them the magic wand, Joe, and that's increase our visas.
Oh, yes, absolutely. And I think that that's a message that is reaching the Hill much better than it has in years past. A number of organizations, and I really speak to IIUSA, which I'm involved with, I think they've done a great job in providing a lot of information in different forms to stakeholders, to legislators, and I'm encouraged by seeing how they're responding and really beginning to understand and appreciate what's necessary for the next steps forward. And this is perhaps what fuels my optimism, but maybe I'm a little bit like Charlie Brown when Lucy pulls away the football, and nevertheless, that next time I still go running to kick it.
We might get the goal the next time.
I know.
Well, Joe McCarthy, I'm certainly not going to pull the football away from you. Instead, I will say thank you for coming on EB-5 Investment Voice and exploring the post-offering obligations for regional centers, as well as the EB-5 issuers. What's changed with COVID and what has mostly stayed the same? Again, it has been a pleasure having you on.
Well, thank you for having me. I've really enjoyed being here, and this has been a lot of fun.
Thank you for being with us today on EB-5 Investment Voice. The topics presented in this podcast is informational in nature and is not to be taken as specific legal advice. If you have questions on the topics presented in this episode or other investment immigration needs, please contact Mona Shaw and Associates. Mona and her attorney staff can be reached at mshawlaw.com. That's mshawlaw.com. Make sure you don't miss our next episode focusing on a different aspect of the EB-5 program by subscribing to the podcast. While you're at it, leave us a rating on iTunes. If you really found this episode valuable, share it with someone else that could benefit from this information. Until then, I'll see you on the next episode of EB-5 Investment Voice.